This is Shadows Travels, Chapter 1, Sunset. It is a original work, character origin, fantasy adventure. There's a content warning for mild language and a little bit of sparring violence, no actual blood or anything. Alright. Mind your footing. He's bigger, so he'll knock you off balance easier. Adjusting his grip on the hilt of his wooden sword, the student felt some sweat drip off his brow, hitting the reed mat beneath his feet. The man before him, his teacher, stood easily a head taller, and nearly two of him in width. He loves using his size to his advantage. If only he wasn't so damn light on his feet to boot. A loud crack resounded through the room as their swords met for a moment. The student placed his foot behind him to steady himself as he recoiled from the strike. Though both of his hands held his weapon, his master was swinging with just one arm and still threw him off. "Come on, Zahn! You're going to have to strike back if you want to win this one." Master Rondix shouted, his excitement almost contagious. He lived to fight. He was the weapons master, after all. Rondic took a step forward, his stance high and yet somehow rooted. Every inch of his body was honed for this, like a well-oiled machine, or artist's masterpiece. Maybe less thinking about how much better he is than me and more thinking about what I can actually do about it, Zahn thought, clenching his jaw tighter than it already had been. His teeth ached in response. The young swordsman considered his options. "Any day now!" Rondic laughed, lunging suddenly. Zahn batted the swing aside, a parry more in name than technique. Sloppy. Instead of the hesitant single strike, Rondic took this opportunity to lay on the pressure, each step forward bringing another heavy strike towards Zahn's midsection. "You can't keep this up forever, Zahn. But I can." Patiently, silently, Zahn weathered the storm, putting his weapon between each strike purposefully. Every stride Rondic took forward was nearly two for Zahn. He had to cycle to the right to stop himself from being pinned to the wall. Keep your senses open. Wait for an opening. 2 steps to match as one. Block, step, step, block, step, step. "Come on, Zahn! I trade you better than..." Zahn took one extra step. Instead of a block, Rondic's weapon met air. With no resistance, he overextended. Zahn dipped forward and brought his sword up to meet his teacher's chest. Got him! A resounding crack went through the room once more as Zahn's wooden blade met Rondic's. Zahn blinked in surprise. "Good one, kid," Rondic chirped. Then, in one smooth motion, his foot hooked around Zahn's and the young swordman was on his back, wind out of his lungs. His vision blurred for a moment and Zahn tried his best to force himself to breathe again, coughing. Rondic's belly laugh shook the floor beneath him, and he was vaguely aware of a hand held out to help him up. With a hesitant laugh of his own, Zahn took the hand and was pulled bodily up to his feet. Zahn exhaled, still trying to catch his breath. "How did you do that? Even as fast as you are, you were way overextended and..." Zahn caught himself babbling and looked up at the bigger man. Rondic's grin split his face almost in two. "Well, you just gonna sit there slack-jawed, or do you gonna watch?" The master boomed, his casual speaking tone somehow louder than most people's shouting level. Zahn nodded wordlessly, moving off to the training mat. He watched it with practiced interest as Rondic weaved the familiar magic into the sand beneath the mats, a strand of spirit pulling the recent memories out of the area around them. 2 columns of sand slowly rose out of the mats, forming into rough recreations of Rondic and Zahn, though minus any defining features, like clay models only on the first step. With a magical nudge from his master, the sandy doppelgangers began to go through the final motions of the fight. Zahn watched as Sandhim stepped back that one extra time, just enough to put Rondic off balance. He watched the swing go ride, and Sandhim go for the strike. Zahn blinked, and somehow Rondic had gotten his arm all the way back into position in time it took Zahn to move his sword from sweep to strike. "No way, slow it down," Zahn protested, eyes locked on the duplicates. Rondic obliged, channeling the magic once more, and the sand reconstituted itself back in the beginning poses. After a moment, they caught back up to the moment, and Rondic warped the threads just a little, slowing down the playback. Its painstakingly slow motion, Zahn watched as Sandhim stepped forward, preparing to swing right upwards into Sand Rondic's chest. Sand Rondic, however, seemed to speed up for just a moment. While Zahn swung at the snail's place, Sand Rondix cranked his arm at a seemingly normal, if still speedy, space, back from its off course and over to block Zahn's attack with a single fluid movement. The sand connected, and their movement synchronized back into slow motion. "You slowed down time?" Zahn asked, confusion playing on his face. Rondic released the hold on the magic, punctuated by a guffaw that immediately caused Zahn to flush a light red. If I could do that, kid, I'd be the master of Arcana. That wide grin of his never faltered, and Zahn felt himself smiling back. Contagious was definitely the word for Rondic's personality. No, I didn't mess with time, but I did enhance myself to make it look that way. Zahn's wide-eyed stare must have been sufficiently pleading, as Rondic laughed again and gave Zahn a hearty slap on the back. You know I'm absolute ass at teaching magic, kid, but you're not quite late for your last lesson today, so I'm sure you could squeeze that little request into V before it's past your bedtime. Rondic bellowed another hearty laugh. Zahn could only laugh with him, and then the reality of Rondic's words hit him. My last lesson, he thought with a sense of, was that dread? Shaking himself, he bowed to Rondic, then trotted over to replace his training weapon with the rest, and took off out of the Spartan room. 20 years. Zahn had grown up here in the cyclic monastery his whole life, the first fifth of his expected lifespan. Throughout this time, he had taken rather well the monastery's system of schooling, studying combat under Master Rondic, magic under Master V, and academics under Master Tyrael. Some of his fellow students seemed to gravitate towards one in particular, but Zahn found he enjoyed each of them in their own way. Though if he had to pick, Arcana had always fascinated him. Through the central garden, Zahn made his way across the gravel path, feeling the pebbles beneath his toes as he strode towards the front of the monastery. He typically practiced with Rondic with only wrappings on his feet. He probably should have grabbed his sandals. Ah well, this is probably better for comfort anyway. Master V had a knack for knocking him off his feet, more so than even Rondic did. Out the front gate, there was a path that wound down towards the forest, but to the right, a large open field made the best place for practicing things that would probably burn down a building if they got out of hand. Near the edge of the field, closer to the front gate, the impressive figure of Master V stood overseeing the last bits of practice their students were going through. A small show of lights made the field glow a various assortment of reds, blues, greens, and the likes. V was showing them how to hold magic threads for prolonged periods of time without wearing themselves out. Kian, focus on the amount of magic you're using. You can use even less if you make the threads finer. Once the effect is in place, it's up to your control to allow you to siphon only as much power as you need to keep the threads in place. V's calm, controlled voice was zero nonsense, as they always were. They held themselves like a diplomat, always knowing what they were about to say and do next. Zahn respected that about them the most, he thought. It was as he strode up that V noticed Zahn and waved their hand in front of them. With a motion akin to that of an orchestral conductor silencing his performers, V carefully plucked the threads their students were holding from their metaphysical hands and folded them out of existence. The ease with which the master did so made Zahn gasp in spite of himself. He felt his cheeks light aflame when V's mouth twitched in a half-smile. They had heard him. He glued his eyes to the ground and tried and cool his burning face. Thank you for your time tonight, students. You are dismissed for the evening. Enjoy your weekend. A single unified, "Thank you, Master," came as a response, and the other students began to collect themselves and disperse. V then turned to Zahn and gave him a short, controlled bow. Good to see you on time, Zahn. Master V hummed, their eyes glowing a soft blue. Zahn, eyes still on the ground, almost didn't bow back, but jerked to do so when his brain finally registered to do so. He didn't get to see if V smiled again, but he heard an airy chuckle that gave him his answer regardless. Are you prepared for your final lesson? I hate that you all keep saying it like that, Zahn replied without thinking. He winced a little at his own tone and raised his eyes to meet theirs. I'll come back eventually. Whether you do or not, I will have nothing left to teach you, Zahn, V said soothingly, the tone of someone trying to calm a crying infant. Zahn couldn't much blame them. Come, let us begin. V gestured, beckoning the young man to follow them closer to the center of the field. So, my pupil, my lesson today starts with you needing to pull up your strongest spell, as much as you can at once, and throw it at me. Zahn blinked twice, then cocked his head to the side and pondered what V could be after. Shrugging, mentally instead of physically, he took a deep breath and began the process of sculpting the spell. Well, sculpting was the wrong word. It was more like weaving. Reaching out with his mind, Zahn connected with the magical essence within himself. It was a little different for everyone, but Zahn imagined it a lot like grabbing an orb he imagined just out of his vision. With his brain. Yeah, it was usually something that odd. From there, you had to sort of pull at the threads you found there. There were 5 base threads, the 4 elemental threads, fire, earth, air, and water, and the thread of spirit, or soul, or void, depending on the person writing the paper. Zahn liked spirit, so he called it that. Anyway, pulling on these threads let you weave them into specific patterns. By using more magical energy, you could make the threads thicker, causing more of something, or making it harder to stop. Or you could make them thinner, making the effect subtler and more controlled. You could tie knots in the threads so they kept going on their own, and so on. Once you had the threads in the right pattern or place, the effects manifested, you called it a spell, and it did what you wanted to do. Most of the time. For this moment, Zahn took threads of fire and earth and bloated them with as much magic as he could muster. V had once told him that dumping all of your magic into a single spell was a really bad idea. Luckily, they had also told him how to at least manage a really big spell safely. So, following that lesson, Zahn slowly fed his magic into the increasingly hard-to-manage threads, then began to fold them over one another into the spell as they continued to grow. Once he began to feel that telltale headache that told him it was time to cut his losses, Zahn completed the weave and watched as the light from the dark sun nearly tripled by the flaming ball of rock that suddenly appeared in the sky. It wasn't a clever spell, but it was a big spell, and that's just what V asked for. So Zahn, breathing a bit heavy from the exertion, was still proud of his work. V seemed about as unfazed as they usually were, peering up at the meteor with a squint that belied what Zahn knew was them calculating exactly what they were going to do. And, much like with Rondic, he almost blinked and missed it. With a single strand of spirit that had somehow honed razor sharp, V struck the weave Zahn had created and wormed its way into the weave itself. Like a hook in a fish's mouth, V pulled, and Zahn's eyes widened as he felt the weave slip out of his metaphorical fingers. And then began soaring back towards him, the meteor descending on him much faster than he initially said it. "All right, Zahn, here you are. Your final lesson. Defend yourself." V shouted above the roar of the meteor's flame, their usually stoic face alight with excitement and expectation. Zahn's eyes couldn't get any more out of their sockets, and he stepped back a few feet to get a hold of himself, or at least try, in vain. What am I supposed to do? Zahn thought wildly, casting about for an idea that wouldn't come to him. Another step took him backwards, and into the folds of someone's robes. "You've heard me tell you that our magic system is always ours." The calming voice of Tai Shu rang in Zahn's ear, two gentle hands on his shoulders keeping him from collapsing in shock. "When a knotted weave is left out too long, you can always siphon it back to yourself to reclaim some power. The same goes for any weave, even the ones that have been stolen like V has. Reach out, find your own magic, and unravel it." Zahn nodded absently, finding comfort in his master's embrace. Taking in one more shaky breath, Zahn did as he was told. He reached out, finding the weave. The heat from the meteor caused him to sweat more than he already was from the effort. He felt his face becoming much warmer than it had been from the embarrassment. Focus, focus, focus. The massive threads he spun were still familiar, despite them now soaring directly at him. Where had he finished the weave? Or what was the final piece? Desperately, he picked at the seams. He tried to work backwards, and eventually he had to just start from the beginning. Tracing his way along the threads, he found where he had ended the spell and plucked that final attachment off. A torrent of energy flooded back into him. He hardly realized just how much he had forced into the spell, now that only a portion of it was coming back into him. Yeah, his arms felt rubbery, like he had just done 1,000 practice swings, but somehow he was ready to go. The feeling passed rather quickly, and not before he nearly collapsed in a whiplash. Tai chuckled quietly as he supported Zahn on his way down. Now they were sitting in the field together. The meteor was gone. Huh, I did that, Zahn thought distantly. V strode up and joined them in the grass, seated properly and calmly in contrast to their excitement from before. That was very well done, Zahn. They spoke evenly. Did you know Master Tai would give me the answer? Zahn asked hoarsely. His throat had dried from the equally dry air. He had coughed a few times, and Tai offered him a water skin, which he took greedily. That was the plan, yes. V laughed, a breathy laugh of someone who was blessing you with their laugh. You still had to do it yourself. That was the test, after all, and you did wonderfully. Thank you, Master, Zahn breathed, feeling his eyelids droop. Was he tired? But he had just gotten all that energy. You might want to practice that a bit more and get the magic to not backfire like that. But that was to be expected from your first attempt, Tai explained, a gentle patting of Zahn's back. You did do well, my son. Go ahead and rest. You have a big day tomorrow. Zahn gave his adopted father a faint nod and leant into him some more, feeling his mind slowly fade to unconsciousness. Oh yeah, it's my birthday tomorrow. Finn.
Happy birthday. Oh no.
No.
Oh no.
I've been holding that the whole time.
Oh no. Happy birthday, yes.
So that one was a little wonky pacing in my opinion, but I'll fix it up as we go on. Not good at opening.
It is WIP Club.
I think that it was pretty good. And it's always, I don't know, dude. I like villain stories, and it's always so hard to see characters like this when they're happy and still not making absolutely wretched choices and knowing where they're headed. There's something.
I'm gonna make you all fall in love with Zahn, and then I'm gonna take him away from everyone.
That's fun.
Oops. Oh, whoop.
It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy
Challenge
arc, and
accepted?
it's really neat.
I will not fall in love with him. How about that? You're gonna have to convince me.
Oh boy. You have to convince Sam.
I'm not generous. Like Stellar.
He's just a baby. He doesn't know no better.
No.
Alice says no.
I think that this is a good starting point because it kind of lays the groundwork out for the world right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
We learn something about his skills. We learn something about the magic system he's going to be dealing with. We learn something about the life that he's lived and the relationships he's had. All of the contact with people he's having are good ones. We learn a lot about him that will become very important to have as grounding through the rest of the story. I think that the thing you're picking up on that you don't like is actually the pacing. Yeah. But that's like small beans. Like, you have the content there. It's like you are doing the right things with this chapter, and you have all of the right pieces, and it's just getting in there and fiddling with it until you're just happy with it. I think that it's solid.
Thank you. That's all I can hope for.
You'll get it. You don't have to get it right the first time. That's the nice thing about writing.
You're not expected to get it right the first time.
Says you. I was in GT.
I mean,
I really like James. Oh, go on.
Sorry. I will say, okay, how do I put it? If you go in expecting to get it right the first time, and that is your mindset, you will walk away with a subpar piece, no matter how good the first one is.
I know. It's just that old gifted and talented extra AP courses and all that nonsense.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say most of the people in here get that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's relatable, but okay, how do I put this into words? If you go in with your with that mindset, you are robbing yourself of your best work, no matter how good your first draft is.
Mm-hmm. You get too attached to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Too much pressure. I really like the way you describe magic and how to use it here. How it's like something they weave together, like an art almost, or a tapestry. And that they can use that same metaphorical understanding of it to unweave spells or steal them and throw them back at each other. Yeah, that too.
Does anyone know what I ripped that? Does anyone know what I ripped that from?
I probably do, but I don't remember.
Good. I don't have to say. I don't have to give away my secrets.
I feel like I do know. I just don't know what it was called. I'm going to wake up at like 4 a.m. tomorrow morning and suddenly understand.
Yep.
As far as an introduction to the world and the magic system goes, this is effective. We understand how combat in the story is going to work. Right, okay. Right. That's it.
Apicule.
I really appreciate the setup that you've put into the way the magic system works with this. Like how, like you've already established something about how it's done, how it's built, the way it affects the user, that it is very difficult to turn someone's own weapons against them.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a lot of pieces and a lot of brain food to work with so that as we start to see what people can do, with the magic system, we have a little bit of understanding of how that functions and why, which helps us not get lost, which I think often happens with magic systems where things are happening wildly and the audience doesn't have the tools to follow or understand what's happening or why. You give us the tools to understand right out the gate, which I think is really good. It's a good storytelling choice.
It's very low fantasy, very mathematical, sort of scientific understanding of magic that will place a lot of emphasis on the intricacies of the system and the technicalities of it as we move through the story. By introducing magic first in combat in general. Arendelle, that derailed me. Okay. The first chapter centering entirely around Zan's graduation from basically combat school kind of places the idea of magic front and center for the story, where exploring the system is going to be a major theme in it alongside of Zan. If that's what you want it to look like, then that's what it does.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
It gives me a good it gives me good context for what people are seeing.
Okay.
As it matters.
Because right now we don't know much about Zan, except that his parents died to save his life, and he is now about to graduate. And he gets along with all his mentors, which are good things to know about him. They make him instantly, like, this is our protagonist, we'll be getting to know him. Right now I don't see anything that really makes him stand out in my mind, I think. Which, it's the first chapter, you know. You don't have a lot of time, and you do need to establish this system if we're going to be spinning the whole story with it, and if it's going to be important to the resolution of the story. Like, it's really important to get that understanding down first thing.
Chapter 2 is the call to action. Chapter 2 is it's going to explain why you need to care about him, not why you're caring about the world.
Cool.
So, editor brain flipping on. Tell me if I need to shut it off before I start.
Go ahead.
So what you do really well with this chapter is you lay out the groundwork. So basically with this story, you're going rules first, which is a really solid setup to go in and say, okay, this is how things work, and now I'm going to tell you a story about these things. That's a solid setup. And about Zahn, you've established that even though his story had a very tragic beginning, he has had a reasonably happy in-between. He trusts his mentors. He enjoys the people that he's around. He enjoys school. He has had a good life since his tragic beginning. Those are the two things you establish really well and are very important. I think that the two things that this front part is lacking, which you might be able to bring in another draft, is individuality from Zan. So potentially by working with like the in-between moments, like we see a little bit of his personality when he is in training with each of these mentors. If instead of going back to back on these action scenes, you give him a little bit of time to get from point A to point B, or I think that might be your most effective tool, is instead of having him jump straight to his magic teacher's class, have him get there and give us a moment to see him kind of being in his home, how familiar he is of it, how he thinks of it, just kind of basket catch his thoughts of how he's experiencing where he's at. Potentially have him have a brief interaction with other students or avoid them. Give us just a little bit of moment of just him without the magic system, and kind of showcase something about how he thinks and behaves in that moment if you can.
I thought about that. I didn't want to make the chapter drag along too long. I was wondering if that would be a too much situation.
It entirely has to do with how you do it. I think that the combat things could be a little bit streamlined, just like from a flow perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And if you streamlined the fight scenes to make them really dense, like every line and every word has meaning, and you bring us through it in a good tempo, you will have earned the time for a slow moment. Which you can kind of have him going from point A to point B. And another thing too is you could also have him kind of mentally work up to some of the realizations he has. Like, instead of it being like, ooh, he's surprised that it's his last day, you can kind of show his mental process leading up to it. So it's like he knows people just keep saying it to him instead of it's said to him and all of a sudden he realizes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, did they not tell him the night before that tomorrow would be his last day?
Yeah. And that hits his birthday and like things that he should just know. Kind of giving him the brain space to kind of see that that's where his mind is already at instead of being a realization.
Gotcha.
I see that.
As well.
Oh.
Sorry, continue.
No, you're saying basically everything I would say except better. Go on.
That tends to happen.
The other thing is that Zan knows. These two scenes kind of feel a little bit disjointed because we don't understand why they're happening when they're happening. Like, Zan knows that these are his final exams, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And that will affect the way he processes and thinks through them and his emotional state as he deals with them. In context of just showing a bit more from his perspective, kind of giving us the info that these are his final exams or that these are really big moments for him personally will kind of give us an understanding of why these things are happening and give them more grounding and placing in the story instead of just having them be showcases of the magic system, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It gives them a reason to exist thematically and for what you need for the chapter. And then in the world and from the character's perspective, they also have a reason to exist. And that leaves them feeling very stable and grounded.
All right. That makes a lot of sense. All right, thank you. I think that it gives a lot of better thoughts for what I was struggling with.
It's a really good base. You have all of the pieces. You just have to put on the extra layer, which, frankly, that's what multiple drafts and that's what it takes to do writing well. So you're doing good, and it's really cool, and I'm very excited to see where this goes.
It's nice. All right.
Does anyone have any other thoughts or comments?
Hold on, I gotta
Excited?
find the unmute button.
Excitement.
Yeah, this will be a really fun story, I think. I'm looking forward to seeing where you go with it. I'm looking forward to seeing what kinds of questions you ask and what kinds of choices Zan has to make. And I'm interested in what causes him to start making the wrong ones.
I love the character that makes wrong decisions.
We do love those characters here.
Yes.
Cough.
I think Allie has you covered there.
What?
Whoop.
Another.
Whoops.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah, I didn't hear what anyone said. I'll let it go.
Good night, everybody.
My word.
Just gonna excuse myself.
Here we go.
Good meme.
Anyway,
Thank you for sharing, Jacob.
Yes, thank you for
absolutely
sharing.
wonderful.
Thank you for sharing.
Love the voice work. Voice work is very good. Deserve credit for that as well.
I'm going to
That's
say
the
one more
only
time.
thing I missed out on the last one.
That accent was very nice.
Yes.
Which what?
These.
Yeah, I like it.
It's very good. Danny and I were both immediately, ooh, that's a nice voice. Like
I already
you
said
got,
this. Oh, sorry.
you gave them such like this smooth assuredness under it too, which I really like. Like they know what they do and they know what they do. Anyway, so you were saying?
Nothing. I was just going to say again that I'm so excited about the magic system and to see what it does because the setup is cool. I like it a lot.